Welcome to the second of two World Sociology screencasts on education and global development. And in this short video we're going to look at the role that education plays in development from the perspective of the theories that we've been looking at throughout the World Sociology course. And I'm going to suggest that both modernisation theory and the people-centred approaches that we associate with the counter-industrial theories are broadly positive about the role of education, although they have different views about what type of education works the best. I'm also going to suggest that the neoliberal perspective, represented by people like Bill Easterly, are much more sceptical about the role that education plays in stimulating development. And then finally we're going to look at dependency theory, which is a bit more ambivalent about the role of education in development for reasons that will become clearer later. And modernisation theory is particularly positive about the role played by formal education systems in promoting development. And this is because they believe that formal education, so making sure that children go to school, has two positive functions. Firstly, they think that it helps the economy by training up the workforce and making sure that people are allocated their job on the basis of their ability and their effort. And secondly, modernisation theory believes that formal education can help poorer countries overcome some of their cultural barriers to development. And this is because education can act as an important agency of socialisation and therefore can be used to transmit modern norms and values that challenge some of the aspects of tradition within a poorer country that might stand in the way of development. So modernisation theorists believe that the purpose of education is to promote economic growth, to promote economic development, to allow the country to become more wealthy. And because they think that education has a really important role to play in development, they believe in nationwide systems of education provided by the government. And in terms of what the children actually learn when they're at school, they would argue that a Western model based on the types of curriculums that you can find in countries that have already developed is the most appropriate form of curriculum. And of course this reflects the kind of modernisation theory assertion that development involves poorer countries becoming more like us. Now, the people-centred approaches that we associate with the counter-industrial perspectives are also positive about the role of education, but they have a different role about the best type of education system compared to modernisation theory. And in particular, they don't necessarily agree with the idea that you have to impose a national system of education that is the same on all areas of a developing country. And in class we're going to look at a case study. We're going to look at the case of the Karamojong people of northern Uganda to show that maybe a one-size-fits-all educational solution doesn't necessarily work. And we see that the types of subjects that are generally taught within modern formal education do not really apply to the Karamojong people unless they wish to someday lead their community altogether. So we'll look at this case study in detail in class, but there are all kinds of problems with a one-size-fits-all educational policy. So although both of these perspectives, modernisation theory and the people-centred approaches, are positive about education, the latter approach is different. So they believe that the main purpose of education is to empower individuals. For example, they think that literacy is a really important form of individual empowerment. Secondly, rather than having a nationwide education system, they think that sometimes it's appropriate to be sensitive to the local context, as we see with the Karamojong case study. And linked to that, they think that the curriculum design has got to be based on the existing knowledge systems that you find within developing countries, that it's not necessarily a good idea to impose a Western model. Let's now take a look at a perspective that's a lot more sceptical about the benefits of education for development. And the theory that we're going to look at is neoliberalism. So neoliberal thinkers such as Bill Easterly are much more sceptical about the benefits of education for development. And Easterly argues that there is no point in governments supplying education in developing countries unless there is a clear demand for it. And Bill Easterly argues that in many developing countries, the quality of government education is very, very low. And he argues the reason for this is that at the moment, parents do not care enough about it, and therefore they're not putting pressure on schools and teachers to offer a better service. And the reason that they don't care enough about it, according to Easterly, is at the moment parents know that the actual benefits of sending their children to school are actually quite low. And that if parents believe that education would have a big impact on their lives, you would get a situation where people would send their children to private schools that would be set up for them, or if that was too expensive, they would demand that local governments set up schools. So from the perspective of neoliberalism, the best education policy is no education policy. Instead, they argue that government should focus on making it attractive to invest in business, which requires educated workers, and then that will create a need for an educated labour force and therefore a pressure to supply it. And when parents really value education, they will put pressure on teachers to deliver. So from the perspective of neoliberalism, education is just another form of investment, and people invest in education as they invest in anything else to make more money in the form of increased earnings in the future. So the priority for neoliberals is to get the economy going before you invest in education. So neoliberals argue that in many developing countries, government education systems are simply not delivering. So here's some data from India. Close to 35% of children in the 7 to 14 age category could not read a simple paragraph. Almost 60% of children could not read a simple story, and only 30% could do second grade maths. And in many developing countries, one of the big issues that undermines education are the number of days that teachers are absent from work. So we looked at Uganda in the previous screencast. There's a huge problem of teachers not turning up for work within the education system in Uganda. So on average, Ugandan teachers in the state sector tend to miss 2 whole days of work out of every 5. And this is usually because the low government salaries that are on offer for teachers force teachers to find a second job in order to supplement their income. Okay, let's finish this presentation by briefly having a look at dependency theory, which you can see I put in the middle of the Venn diagram. And the key figure here is Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian educationalist who wrote a very influential book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And his view is that education is never neutral. It either liberates or it domesticates. And what he means by this is that education can potentially be a really positive force. It can liberate people and enable them to take greater control over their lives and over society and politics. But in practice, he argues that it often functions as a form of social control. So Freire argues that the problem with conventional education is it's mainly being used to control people, and it's being used to reproduce the types of workers and consumers that are required within a capitalist economy. So this is essentially a kind of Marxist perspective, which argues that there is a close correspondence between the ways in which people and children are treated in the workplace and also in the school. In other words, through school, children get used to their future exploitation. So from this perspective, the problem with conventional education is it's all about social control. It's all about reproducing the types of social relationships that you find within the workplace. So for Freire, the problem with the conventional approach to formal education is it doesn't encourage students to think critically about society, and it doesn't fire a desire to challenge the views that they're taught. So according to Freire, schools that adopt this conventional approach become nothing more than pipelines producing robotic citizens, perpetuating the vision of a capitalist society that actually works against their interests. However, despite his reservations about the conventional approach to education, Freire argues that if schools change their approach to teaching and learning and adopt a perspective that he calls critical pedagogy, then education can be a force for good, a force for liberation. That education does have the power to change social inequality by nurturing a generation with an educated mistrust of everything that has been indoctrinated before. So the whole idea of critical pedagogy is to encourage students to develop critical thinking skills and ask questions about the accepted social truths that are normally relayed to people by the political system and by the media. In other words, rather than education being used to integrate people into the status quo, into the existing system, according to Freire, liberating education should enable students to transform society.